Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast where we interview researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines on psychology and mental health. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development and mental health research fellow based at King's College London.
And I'm Chloe Carrick. I'm a PhD student studying structural brain development in adolescence at King's College London. And this is the Science or Fiction podcast.
So before we get started, we have officially launched our first Science or Fiction live. So we'll be hosting a live podcast recording in London on Monday, the 28th of October. We'll be interviewing experts, both researchers and lived experience advocates on self-diagnosing ADHD. There'll also be a Q&A where you can ask your questions and merch and prizes. We have sold out in person, but there is a waiting list, so please do sign up. Or you can sign up online and you can watch the live stream and still send in your questions for researchers. All the information is on our website, scienceorfiction.co.uk, and we really hope to see you there. So a quick content warning and reminder. In this episode, we are discussing pregnancy. We use the terms women and female to discuss pregnancy-related topics, but we recognise that not all women will experience pregnancy, and not all who experience pregnancy identify as women. What happens to the brain during pregnancy? Pregnancy involves drastic physical and hormonal changes. The production of hormones can increase by 1,000 times for some expecting mothers. Nearly 85% of women will become pregnant in their lifetime, but we know surprisingly little about what happens to the brain during pregnancy. A new study scanned a first-time mother's brain 26 times throughout her pregnancy, and this study has really captured people's attention. It's been featured in over 300 news articles at the time of recording. Why has this study made such a splash, and what have we learned about the brain? This week, we're interviewing the lead author of the paper, Dr. Laura Pritchett. Thanks so much for being here today, Laura.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And as you said, the metric that I wasn't familiar with, the 300 times, it's really important to now dive into what we can say about this paper and what we can't, and why it's such a big splash, and making such a big splash is really something to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And also a really warm welcome to Chloe, who's helped produce this episode and is co-hosting with me today.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, I'm really excited to be here.
Just before we do get into the depths of the paper and what you found, can you just tell us a bit about what you do and how you got there?
Yes, absolutely. So formally, I am a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And I consider myself a researcher at the intersection of neuroendocrinology and neuroscience. To put that simply, I explore how sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone influence the human brain. And when I ask people to tell me what comes to mind when I say estrogen or testosterone, I usually get the two major answers of reproduction and fertility, or something like aggression or other forms of behavior. And while that's true, hormones are a central facet of reproductive life, it actually goes beyond that. And so sex hormones exert an influence way beyond these sort of traditional reproductive track from our brain and our body. They exert an influence on areas involved in executive functioning, memory, and attention, and they're neuroprotective in the brain. They influence cerebral blood flow, and they communicate with neurotransmitters, the chemical messenger of the central nervous system. And so I'm really fascinated and interested in exploring how those hormones impact a variety of things related to the brain, such as cognition, behavior, and brain health itself. The other thing about sex hormones is that they're not static, and throughout our lifespan, they fluctuate in a meaningful way. So we sort of have these natural paradigms to study that interplay of our endocrine system and our nervous system. And so from adolescence and puberty, when hormones go online, and then fluctuating throughout the menstrual cycle, from day to night, these sort of circadian rhythms. Our hormones are influenced by exogenous hormone treatments, such as the very common oral contraceptives, to pregnancy, which I'll talk about today, and then aging, sort of menopause, andropause, the bookend of puberty when hormones go offline. there's so much to explore. However, with respect to humans, we don't really have a super clear grasp on how those hormones and those reproductive time points impact the brain. And so I do this and I try to tackle this by studying people along those reproductive time points, measuring their hormone levels and pairing that to non-invasive neuroimaging techniques such as MRI. And that allows us to study anatomy of the brain and function of the brain and tie that to cognition, behavior, and health outcomes. And to sort of give a little bit more of a background, step back further, that was not always what I was wanting to study. But I want to highlight for especially any of the young investigators or budding scientists here, kind of the three unique experiences that shaped the trajectory of my research that led me to where I am now. So I was a undergraduate studying psychology at the University of Illinois, sort of in the center of the U.S., everyone's favorite place. And I was wanting to be a psychiatrist or a physician, really interested in sort of the medicine aspect. But I took my first behavioral neuroscience course and just fell in love. And it was so crazy to me that 86 billion neurons were working in the brain to underlie complex behavior, from motor and action to memory and personality. It was a sort of a mystery. As I think Barack Obama says, it's the moonshot of our generation to understand how the brain works. And so I joined some research labs to study cognition, and I did this in a variety of ways, both in a cognitive development lab to study how kids from 5 years old to 11 develop their critical thinking skills, to a more neuroscience, human neuroscience lab where we used MRI to study brain networks themselves. So look at how brain networks communicate to underlie successful cognition. So at that point, I knew I wanted to explore the neural underpinnings of cognition from some sort of lifespan approach. And that was great. And I knew I wanted to go to grad school then, but I didn't. That's a broad topic. I didn't know exactly how I wanted to narrow that down. And something really pivotal happened in my junior year where I was sitting in a behavioral neuroscience course. And one of the tasks and one of the assignments we had to do each week was read the assigned research paper and come up with a few questions to ask about it, which I think is a very good activity for everyone to do. And so we were really focused on sort of rodent and mice studies where they were like playing with the brain, dissecting it and trying to understand physiology there. And something I noticed the first week was that we studied a paper and the only rodents that were studied were males. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Maybe it's just this paper or whatever. It's a one-off. It happened again and again. And so I sort of made it my thing to my first question being asked is, where are the females? Or where are the other half of this sex? And I got an answer when that question was addressed to the class that I've heard now over and over again, which was, oh, well, females have an estrous cycle, this sort of parallel to the human menstrual cycle. And since their hormones fluctuate, it's just too messy, it's too variable. So we tend to just study males. And now I got upset for a couple reasons, which I think many people would. One, that is, leading to this sort of misrepresentation or underrepresenting the sexes. And two, to me, that's illogical. Why are you saying that because females have this fundamental variable feature to their physiology, we can't study them, but then take males and apply their findings back to females? And I think this is an important point, again, for young listeners when we're thinking science versus fiction. Those studies, the headlines and the titles do not clarify that they were only studied in male animals. So we're building our knowledge base. You're taking, a title and taking it as fact or remembering it that might not actually be applicable to the other sex. So that, that was fresh in my mind of this is a weird dogma that we have in our field. The third aspect of this personal aspect, because science and everyday life cannot be separated, is that I had a friend of mine's mother was going through menopause, and I had known this woman for a long time, and she was very cognitively sharp. And then during that period, so menopause, again, for anyone who isn't super familiar, is that bookend of puberty where in kind of the middle decades of life, 45 to 55, women start to stop cycling. They're having menstrual cycles and their ovarian hormone production decreases by about 95% in a really short period. And she was having hot flashes, so like temperature dysregulation. She was walking into a room and thinking, why can't I remember why I walked in there? And I found that fascinating because, of course, I'm interested in cognition. But after doing my deep dive in my courses, I thought a gut feeling of, I bet we know way less about this than we should. And turns out that was true. So I kind of combined those ideas together. And when I was looking for graduate programs, I thought I want to study this in particular, neural underpinnings of cognition as it relates to females, so that we're no longer playing catch up here. And so I joined a doctoral program at the University of California, Santa Barbara with Dr. Emily Jacobs, where I could kind of fuse my passions together, women's health and equality with neuroscience. And it was the best decision I ever made because now I come to work excited every day to be there. Graduate school, as you guys can attest, is hard. And so you have to have this sort of passion. And I think my biggest takeaway and advice for people on that is challenge dogmas, find the gaps, and place yourself there to fix them or fill them. And it's really exciting and rewarding.
Yeah, thank you for walking us through that. That's so fascinating. And I always love hearing about scientists like light bulb moment that like kind of led them down the path to where they are today, which is really cool. So I guess I was going to ask, like, why is it important to understand what happens in the brain during pregnancy? But you've kind of touched on the fact that hormones change and fluctuate all the way throughout our lifespan, and this affects like our health and our development, and also obviously the fact that like it's just not studied enough. Is that why like this study was so important?
Yeah, I think this is one major aspect of it is this is that the time of your life where your hormone levels are going to be changing and rising the most. And so we need to understand what's going on to the brain just from the pure characterization standpoint. But additionally, as you mentioned, there's a lot of health outcomes tied to pregnancy that are brain based. So going back to my earlier comment, sex hormones are critical neuromodulators in the brain. The endocrine changes across pregnancy, they dwarf those that occur across pretty much any other endocrine state in our lifetime. Yes, highlighting this critical need to map the brain's response to this unique hormonal state. And you brought up the stats, and I just want to reiterate these. Nearly 85% of women will experience one or more pregnancies in their lifetime. And the latest data from the World Health Organization suggests 140 million women are pregnant each year across the world. So this is not sort of a niche topic. This is not a niche experience, but we don't really have the whole brain and body characterized during this time. And I think that's crazy because pregnancy is a transformative period in a person's life tied to, as you said in the intro, profound hormonal and physiological change. So over that approximately 40-week gestational period, the maternal body is undergoing profound changes to support the development of the fetus, including increases in blood volume, oxygen consumption, and immune regulation. These quick and rapid adaptations, I would argue, over a 9-month period, are initiated by this 100 to 1,000-fold rise in hormones like estrogen and progesterone. So the entire body is changing. We tend to, when you see a pregnant icon or something, it's always the belly. The brain is no exception to this change. And we know this from animal models and some human studies that pregnancy is a period of remarkable neuroplasticity. And we can go into that later. But I want to point out that what we've done thus far to approach this question and ask, okay, how is the brain changing during pregnancy is sort of the snapshot approach where we will bring women in preconception and scan their brain, and then early postpartum, bring them back and scan the brain again. And that can, that provides the strongest evidence to date that something during that period is changing because consistently across studies and across cohorts, we are seeing this sort of overall trend of decreased gray matter volume during that time. But what about pregnancy itself? Over what time course do these changes occur? Are they tied to hormones? All of those are open questions. And the sort of comments I get when I'm talking about this work is, it's 2024 though. Like, why do we not actually know? And I'll get into that in a little bit too, because of course, no answer is easy to, can be answered in 2 words, but that's ultimately what our team wanted to provide. And we had to start somewhere. We had to challenge this dogma that you can scan pregnant women. And we also wanted to flip that that model a little bit and say, let's just start with a single individual. Let's scan her brain densely to show that this is doable and worthwhile. And I would argue that the data we see is quite beautiful. But that's another reason why I think this is so uh, proliferative or in the spotlight right now, is because people want to know. People are going through this and they're living through this, whether it's themselves, someone they love, or if they're, just curious. And we don't actually have this map yet. And I think that's shocking. It's not super surprising, but it needs to be remedied. And we took the first step. So
Awesome. And we're going to get into all the definitions, gray matter volume, neuroplasticity. We can definitely get into that later in the episode. So yeah, let's get into the paper and I'll hand over to Chloe.
That was really interesting. Thank you for going through that and why it's so important that we know these things. So now to focus on the paper, in each episode, we dive into the research behind the headlines. And this week, we are talking about your paper, which is entitled Neuroanatomical Changes Observed Over the Course of a Human Pregnancy, which was published in Nature Neuroscience in September this year. So to start off, can you explain some of the key brain changes that were found during pregnancy?
yes, absolutely. So just to, reiterate this protocol of what we did, we scanned someone, first-time mom, who's a fellow scientist, who said, I'm going to be trying to get pregnant soon. I'm going to go through IVF. Why don't you scan my brain? I will volunteer. I understand the risks, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. I want to volunteer. So we scanned her brain using non-invasive MRI from preconception through IVF, through first, second, third trimester, all the way up until 2 years postpartum. And our findings showed that pregnancy was characterized by reductions in gray matter volume, cortical thinning, and enhanced white matter microstructural integrity in step with advancing gestational week. Depending on the metric you're looking at, some of those patterns were linear and some were nonlinear. Nonlinear meaning it can go into sort of any shape. That's not just a static sort of line of increase or decrease, but rather it can peak or fall at a various time point. You can think of nonlinear as an inverted U or a U shape, or kind of a fall and then a rise again, something that isn't just a one-to-one mapping of along a line. However, we found sort of this choreographed dance between our main measures of interest in the brain, and those were also tied to the significant rise in estrogen and progesterone. And so for us, taking this together, these findings reveal sort of an example of a highly dynamic changes unfolding in the brain across pregnancy. And some of these changes did not return to preconception levels, demonstrating what we think is a capacity for extensive neural remodeling well into adulthood. And so if you look at gray matter volume reductions and cortical thinning, those two things are pretty yoked to each other, and we'll describe what those measures mean. But at the same time, if you think about reduction, you think, well, something's got to fill that space. And I think the beauty here is going an extra layer in, where we saw the thinning and the reductions of gray matter volume not only tied to this sort of increased microstructural integrity, but additionally cerebral spinal fluid has risen and lateral ventricles expanded a bit too. So you're not walking around with these sorts of holes in your brain. Your body and your brain has adapted to these changes themselves. And it just was really cool to map that and see what that pace looked like, even in a single individual.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And just to be clear as well, when we're referring to gray matter and white matter, by gray matter, we mean the neuronal cell bodies that are making up that cortex on the outside of the brain. And then for the white matter, we're talking about the pathways of myelinated nerve fibers and axons that are connecting those parts of the gray matter. But then, yeah, I guess my next question then would be, so there are these changes that are found in the brain during pregnancy, but you found that some of those changes, like you've mentioned before, so that to the white matter pathways, they were found to actually return to this pre-pregnancy state after childbirth. And then some of the other changes, like cortical thinning and reductions in gray matter volume, they were more long lasting. So should we be concerned about these changes that were more long lasting, or are changes like this in the brain common?
Yes, this is a great question and certainly at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And a lot of the headlines will say your brain is shrinking during pregnancy, and it's really important to talk about that in the context of the larger literature. So we interpret the findings like this. We see these widespread changes during pregnancy. Some of those findings could just be the brain's response to the physiological demands of pregnancy itself, much like, the uterus and the placenta. Um, Others could reflect a fine tuning of the brain, much like adolescence when there's more specialization that's occurring in the brain. And we think those two things are happening because some areas of the brain show that sort of right in early postpartum that return back to baseline. Some extend, as you mentioned, 2 years postpartum. I like to look at the larger literature. Collaborators of ours have shown this pattern when they have done the pre and post gray matter volume reduction comparisons. They followed some of those women up to 6 years postpartum, and they found that those reductions remained. Yeah, so I would argue and agree that those are long lasting. How we interpret that has some nuance to it. One, I would say that if our brains were reducing and this was a bad thing and we should be concerned about it, we wouldn't have the ability to have complex cognitive behavior or cognition and behavior emerge in that postpartum. Additionally, we can look to the aging literature, which suggests that when you model in these huge population cohort studies like the UK Biobank, um, we can model the amount of pregnancies, the number of times someone's been pregnant, and look at how their brain has aged. You can use these sorts of models that say, are your chronological age based on like this sort of complex computational model, or you look younger? Do you look older? And with the number of pregnancies, there's a sweet spot there between like I think 2 and 4 pregnancies. We actually see that they have younger looking brains. And that is something that's been replicated a handful of times. So I would actually say, one, this is normal. 92% of women across all these studies that have tackled this show that sort of reduction. So this is normal, and we shouldn't be concerned by this. But additionally, the decades that follow are kind of, I think, speaking to the benefit of that, where you may have more specialized brain, you're engaging in a lot more cognitive processes, you're having to kind of activate that theory of mind and think about someone else's needs a lot. And then when you look in the aging literature, it shows that it actually may be beneficial. Now, there's a lot of individual differences there. There's some nuance. It's not a blanket statement, but I think that that's kind of what I'm thinking here is much like adolescence or other periods of organizational effects on the brain. It's actually beneficial to have this sort of specialization. It's beneficial to show this sort of etching and this honing of these circuits.
Yeah, really interesting. And I didn't know that about the aging literature. So mapping these changes to brain age is super interesting. And speaking about, I guess, remodeling. So in the paper, pregnancy is referred to as this major remodeling event in the brain. So what would your message be to anyone who is listening, who is pregnant and might be a bit freaked out about the thought of that as a remodeling event?
Yes, I've been getting a lot of text messages saying,
Yeah.
I shared this with my sister and she's freaking out a little bit. I get this question a lot. I think I can speak a little bit to this idea of mommy brain and pregnancy brain. You hear a lot of changes are happening to your brain, especially, oh, there's reductions. And you think, oh, yes, I've heard about pregnancy brain or mommy brain. And I'm going to lose myself. It's just going to be a nightmare. Myself, along with other experts in the field, I'm really regurgitating what they have said about this. Studying the maternal brain, we want to reframe this notion a little bit. Reorganizational periods, another one being puberty or fetal development or critical periods in infancy, they're there for a reason and they're important. Just like the body is adapting to support the fetus, the brain is too. Now, I want to just take a step back and say, you know, I want to validate that pregnancy is not a cakewalk for many people, and everyone's experiences are different, and that's valid. Some people may be anxious about that, and that's valid too. I don't want to wash away the concerns of one's experience. There's a lot of differences there. But I want to provide an additional perspective on our findings here as a cognitive neuroscientist. And this is something I've personally said to my friends who've recently had babies. Yes, you may be forgetting to email someone back or forget where you left your keys. but you're also keeping an infant alive. This is true for whoever the parent is. You're remembering, I don't know if you've seen this, people chart down when their baby ate, how much they slept, monitoring if they're okay. And a lot of the times they're still doing a bunch of other things in their life, including work or balancing the family, things like that. And so I think of this more as like this cognitive adaptation rather than this detriment. And I think that can be overlooked sometimes. And I hope the listeners here can share that message with any pregnant people that they know that might be anxious to hear these results, or anyone experiences transition through parenthood, is these are normal, they're happening for a reason, and they're usually beneficial. And again, if these were detrimental, this wouldn't be the central facet of reproductive life again. We wouldn't have evolved to be doing this. And I think ultimately, though, to speak to anyone who's freaked out, our study does not speak to the cognitive implications. And in fact, our subject herself said, I didn't feel any of those things, like the cognitive changes or something like that. However, what I hope the study does is validate that things are happening in the brain, and it's powerful, but it can also be a little anxiety provoking, or it can lead to these subtle changes. And we just need to have more support for parents during that time. But I think normalizing it and talking about it and providing these maps can be really validating to say, yeah, I felt stuff and now I see it in the brain, and that's kind of cool. And it may actually calm some people down. However, you don't need to study the brain to validate women's experiences or people's experiences over this period. I just want to make that clear too. But I hope that's what our study provides.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's it's a nice resource to have, is to be able to, if someone is experiencing those changes, that you can actually see that there is something physically happening, to the brain as well. And just to go back then to some of the media coverage about the article. So your co-author, Dr. Emily Jacobs, described the brain changes during pregnancy as like an artist starting off with a big block of marble, and then the underlying beauty is revealed through the art of removal. So carefully honing and fine-tuning the material. So this is what she has said. And the findings of this study, like this analogy, would suggest that pregnancy is then this period of what we call neuroplasticity. So could you explain a bit about what that means? And does that neuroplasticity have any specific advantages or downsides?
Mm-hmm. We love this analogy. Emily and myself are a bit, I wouldn't say melodramatic, but we love to paint this brush and take this narrative back a bit here. And I think this sort of etching and this honing of marble is very fun. And it's actually a nice way of explaining these findings to a broader audience. I think, it's complex biological underpinnings of neuroplasticity, but it's a time period in which our brain can adjust. And I'll start with this because I think this is important. And I spoke on this a few minutes ago. We are quick to liken reductions or decreases with my brain is shrinking, this is bad. We hear this in aging, or if you hit your head, you're like, oh, that probably killed some brain cells. But interestingly, the parallels with adolescence, where we see, and I'll speak to this sort of, similar structural trajectory, which Chloe, you were intimately familiar with. We don't actually have that vernacular. We don't really say like, oh yeah, their brains are shrinking and it's bad. It's actually quite the opposite. And so that's why I think these sorts of analogies are really powerful. So despite what one might think, reductions in gray matter volume are not necessarily a bad thing. Again, this could indicate a fine-tuning of brain circuits, not unlike what happens to young adults as they transition through puberty and their brains become more specialized. I am not comparing and saying that pregnancy is a second puberty, but it's another key organizational period in the brain, and this pregnancy is no exception either. So for instance, adolescence is a dynamic period characterized by region-specific, often nonlinear decreases in gray matter volume and increases in white matter volume. And those maturational brain changes are tied to gains in executive function and social cognition. And for both adolescence and matrescence, this sort of transition to motherhood, that considerable rise in sex steroid hormone production appears to remodel the brain to promote a suite of behaviors adaptive to that life stage. That's not our paper necessarily showing that. Others have, rodents, non-human primates, and some human investigations that have tied the degree of change from pre to post pregnancy to maternal attachment scores or things like that. But to speak to the advantages versus downsides of a system like that, To initiate a more plastic state in the brain, in the simplest form, there are signals being transmitted, and we think one of those signals, major signals, is sex hormones, to say, okay, let's ease up on these inhibitory breaks and allow for some flexibility so that the brain can be adaptive. But anytime your brain or body or system or even a company is in a state like that, there's a window of opportunity and there's a window of vulnerability. It's like a Goldilocks situation or an inverted U. You don't want too much change and you don't want too little. And both internal, so perhaps immune function and your body's immune response, genetics or medical histories, and external, such as your stress or your environment, are risk factors for taking you to either end. The $1 million question, though, is how can we ensure everyone stays in that optimal state? Because plasticity during this period, our brain's ability to be adapted to meet these demands and perhaps fine tune our brain to become more specialized for the future, it's beneficial. But we'd be remiss to not think about the fact that that's not the case for everyone. And that's why we really, as you know, if you're a neurology fellow or if you're a psychiatry fellow, are also interested in pregnancy, because we do know that it is tied to increased risk for mood disorders, one of the most common being postpartum depression, and other neurologically based or neurologically adjacent syndromes such as stroke, epilepsy, eclampsia, migraines, things like that. And I think that's what we need to go into now and try and figure out is, does that change during the gestational period lead to these sorts of adverse effects for some women, and why? And can we map out that Goldilocks problem a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting the way you framed that as in terms of the language that's used to describe the changes that occur in the brain at different points in the lifespan, so that we know that adolescence is this period of neuroplasticity, but that's the way it's referred to, is as a period of neuroplasticity, whereas that might not necessarily be the case for how we would usually describe brain changes during pregnancy. But I think it's amazing that this study can show that the adult brain also has capability for neuroplasticity, because we're more familiar with different neuroplastic periods, which are usually when someone is younger or during adolescence. So I think that's something amazing. Yeah.
And she, our subject was 37, and you hear this a lot. You're hit home around 25, your brain starts to like hit a stable point until it starts decreasing. But well into adulthood, we can show these sorts of things. But yeah, you can see those parallels of those windows of plasticity. I'll speak specifically for adolescence. I think the same is true for other periods like infancy. But yeah, organizational effects on the brain initiated by hormones. You've got cognitive adaptations, you've got specialization in the brain, you have behavioral demands, and you have this sort of risk factor as well for neurological and psychiatric symptoms. So why are we not studying this in more depth? Because not only, and I'll make this point hopefully many times, I don't just tie studying the maternal brain or studying women as like, okay, we got to understand these mood disorders. We won't understand the full capabilities of the adult brain or the brain unless we factor in these, I would argue, somewhat near universal experiences that people have that show just the capacity of the brain to respond. And that could be, that information could be used to better understand, stroke recovery or influence how the brain ages. That to me is somewhat the most convincing of like, okay, why have we been ignoring this? This is so cool.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a period of, adulthood where you're demonstrating that the brain is capable of having these, neuroplastic changes, which can be so translational to so many different fields.
And I also think it's really validating. It's probably very validating for some pregnant women or people that are going to be pregnant to hear that it's like a really big deal. I feel like quite often it's just like assumed in society, like you get to a certain age and then you're going to be pregnant and then you're going to have a child because that's what everyone does. But actually, like, it's very difficult, and it is validating to hear that there is a lot going on.
Yes, honestly, I think that is the power of this, where we can talk about what we can look at it from multiple ways. We can say, and when you think about pregnancy in the larger world we live in too, a lot of that focuses on the fetus. And one example of that is we do a lot of fetal imaging, and that's worthy too. I'm not saying it's an either or, but the pregnant woman was in the scanner as well. We just didn't think to move that table up and scan her in tandem because we tend to prioritize there. And, other people are better at talking about that. But not only on one hand is this profound and cool, and it shows the impact of hormones on the brain. The other thing to address, which I think you hit perfectly, is this is not a cakewalk. And there's no stork dropping the baby off at the doorstep, and your whole body is going through it. We need to recognize that and give grace and say, this is powerful, but you're allowed to also be like, this is hard. But it's happening to the brain as well. And so, I think we need to study and characterize all of that, and then be careful about our language around it too, so that we have maximal validation for all the experiences there. But both are true, and yeah, it's a really important point.
Yeah, definitely. And I can't help but draw the comparisons as well with adolescence with what you said about it being a period of risk, because yeah, during adolescence, you're more likely to have a mental health disorder than in any other period of life. So important understanding that this is also happening during pregnancy, and this is also a period of risk where we need to, understand, I guess, what exactly is going on so that we can then link that to later life mental health.
Yeah, I mean, we start every sort of clinical question, pie in the sky clinical question, with a basic science research. And I think that's what this is. That's what this study is supposed to be, is like, let's characterize this. Let's just map what's happening in the brain. And then we can pass this off to people who can apply it.
Yeah, definitely. The next question that we had was more so towards how the study actually took place. So we know that this study, it only involves one woman and 26 brain scans, whereas a lot of neuroimaging studies that we see in the literature, they'll have a lot more participants, but then a lot less brain scans. So I guess one advantage that we have here is we have a lot of detail about the brain changes in this participant. But we know from the research that there is a lot of variation between individuals and between individual brain structure. So how should we then interpret these results? And do we need to be careful at all about the conclusions that we make from this study?
Yes, this is a great question. I think this is a really important training opportunity also for anyone listening, about how we contextualize a study and how we determine what the study can and cannot say. So to kind of speak back to this idea that we published a pretty high impact paper of an N of one, a single subject design, the number of subjects that you have, we had one subject. Sometimes we refer to that as an N of one study. To answer pressing questions, we need the right methods and the right design for the right questions. And usually what we do typically is bring a bunch of people in at one time point, scan their brain, and that's it. And you can look at, group differences. You can look at how age impacts the brain. You can look at how healthy controls versus, say, a depressed sample differs. But that's not the right design for every single question. With every design, of course, there's pros and cons and there's trade-offs. And I think what we decided to do in our lab was follow this sort of new trend over the past half decade or so, where the researchers are saying, what if we flip that model, that sort of typical traditional cross-sectional model, and we bring in fewer people, but we densely sample them, we deeply phenotype them, we get a lot of information about them, and we can add this sort of parallel approach. And I think of this as those two designs, like the sort of big data approaches versus this precision longitudinal imaging studies, as when you're trying to get your phone to register your fingerprint and you have to kind of tilt it all around. That's what we're doing. These are all parallel approaches to asking the same sort of question, just with different temporal scales, with different levels of detail. And each, again, have caveats. I'm going to explain those. But how this sort of study started was, we actually, a couple years earlier, did this sort of dense sampling design on myself, where we asked, if I scan my brain every single day for 30 days straight across my menstrual cycle, can I see how the day-to-day changes in hormones influence my brain? Because we hadn't done that yet either. We had done maybe one or two time points across the cycle. But for certain questions and for certain systems that you're studying, those are dynamic. And we can't apply a static sampling rate to it. And so we need to have these alternative approaches to help us get more information. And that's how this sort of rose of saying, we see the merit in this. It's not the end all be all. We need to do this a lot more, but let's provide this, let's make this data open access, and let's explore this from a completely different spatial temporal lens. And that's what we did with pregnancy. Again, we see this sort of standard in the field of pre-post pregnancy. Let's now fill in the gaps, and let's do this in a complementary way. And so that's how the researcher on our paper came and said, I want to kind of do what you guys were doing with the menstrual cycle. So this paper is a resource paper in Nature Neuroscience, meaning the goal here was not to speak about generalizability to every single person. It can't, but rather make this sort of a open access data set, offering neuroscientists a detailed map of the human brain across gestation, a resource for which a wide range of previously unattainable neurobiological questions, because it didn't exist, can now be explored, and we can continue this effort. And yes, our findings fit beautifully into an existing literature. We show, again, there's sort of these gray matter volume reductions pre-post. And that is, I think beautiful. We're not actually saying anything really that wild if you know this literature well. But I think of this again, I like analogies, as you can tell, as a puzzle. So this sort of snapshot approach of pre-post pregnancy laid the border. And now what this study is doing is trying to fill in the center of that puzzle. That's one way, that's one trajectory. But the timing in which that puzzle gets filled and how they fill in that puzzle can differ by person. And that's what we need to capture now. And that's not what our study can say. I want to be careful when, people extract from our findings and they say, your brain changes by this percentage and it's in this area and it's during this period of time. I want to make it clear that that's in one person. And that's still valid and really cool. We learn a lot from individual studies and case studies. But that could be different. And we can't just say that as absolute fact. And in fact, that pace of that trajectory, how those changes unfold, and if there are individual differences there, that's what we need to capture. I think that's what's worthwhile, because that's going to tell us a whole lot more. And we know this from, again, the adolescent brain literature, showing that pace of change has a bunch of related outcomes, both in cognition, behavior, mental health risk. And so we are basically saying with this study, this is doable. You can scan pregnant women and it's worthwhile. But now let's repeat it in a demographically enriched cohort of women and try to create that sort of normative chart.
So I've got just a couple of follow-up questions based on that. So firstly, super fascinating to track your brain over the whole menstrual cycle. That could be a whole episode in itself. But I'm just wondering, are there risks involved with like doing that many scans in a short space of time, or like doing that many scans with a pregnant person? But then also, which you kind of touched on, what would be the next steps with this line of research? Like, it's really interesting to hear about this being a resource paper, which is really nice. It's almost like a foundation that then future scientists can build on. So what would you want them to do with it, or what do you plan to do with it?
So to answer your first question, I think this is really important to get right and to clarify, because the other aspect of this proof of concept study is to leverage this for other institutes to say, look, this can be done and let's do it. The first question you're going to get is, well, should we be doing this? We have spoken with experts who are not only physicians, MRI physicists, reproductive psychiatrists, OBGYNs. This is not a high-risk protocol. In clinical imaging, if you go into, say, the emergency room with a headache and you're pregnant, you will get your brain scanned. We do fetal imaging kind of throughout the whole 9-month period. And that risk is very low. And in fact, in a research setting, typically we want to make it as low risk and highest benefit to people. Otherwise, we just don't do those protocols. And there's a sort of carefulness around studying pregnant women or women of reproductive age that's been pervasive throughout our entire human research timeline. We make those protocols adaptive to whoever we're studying. For me, I got scanned for an hour and a half every day for 30 days straight at a 3 Tesla magnetic MRI center. That's really low. It's not going to be impacting my brain. It's not going to be impacting my body. We do proper hearing protection, and we're okay. For a pregnant woman, we want to make that spaced out a bit. The protocols have to be shorter. We don't want them laying on their back as long, but there's no evidence that that is going to have any sort of adverse effect. Additionally, we make everything very clear for participants. So they read the information that we have given them, both from the literature, from experts in the field, and we lay out what the pros and cons of benefit of participating in this study are. They make that decision. And it's actually been really refreshing to see a bunch of women say, I've read this, I understand this. I know that this was sort of a dogma in the field. I'm challenging it and I'm going to participate. It's been really great. So yes, you have to be careful with your protocols. You have to speak to the experts. You have to get it approved. You have to lay out the risks and you have to have consenting individuals participate, but it's doable. And I would sort of argue that the risks of not studying this are higher than any sort of potential unknown risk. Additionally, yes, the next line of research, we can't stop here with an N of one. We know this, everyone knows this. What we are doing now is launching this maternal brain project. And this is the two lead investigators on this project, Emily Jacobs and Liz Crastel, have launched this further. So now more people are going through this protocol. They already have 4 women who've completed their pregnancy scans. The goal is there's 2 arms to this follow-up research from our team in particular. Other teams are also starting to do this, is the sort of dense sampling design where women, 10 people and their partners are being scanned preconception through postpartum. And we're tying that, we've expanded that protocol. Now we're measuring their blood flow. We're looking at immune markers, so on and so forth. And then a second arm is now, again, balancing those trade-offs of design, partnering with leading experts in maternal brain research in Spain to do a less dense sampling study. So, scanning people maybe a couple times throughout their pregnancy, but getting more people. So we're, again, sort of covering that temporal lens a bit and getting at larger samples of people, some more individual differences, and then going in finer detail too. And those are both ongoing. It's probably going to take quite a while. As you know, this is you're not even competing with the 9-month gestational period. It can take a while for someone to experience pregnancy. These are, I just give credit completely to the participants who are volunteering for these studies, because not only was there the aspect of the dogma of safety concerns for scanning pregnant women, it's also a fragile period of time. You have to be quite vulnerable. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do to say, there's pregnancy loss, there's challenges, you may want to not complete the study anymore. We have all of the protections around this protocol, but that's ongoing, and we're going to get more people, and we're going to be able to start to track the pace of those change related to health outcomes. I'm really excited for this new wave of maternal brain research.
That's super exciting. And I guess, like what you touched on earlier, is the ultimate goal to be able to understand more about how the brain is changing during pregnancy, and then how that has implications for the pregnant person after they're pregnant or throughout their life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my typical soundbite is, the more we know about the maternal brain, the easier chance we'll have to provide relief. Additionally, so that relates to, mental health conditions, like 1 in 5 women are going to experience postpartum depression, but also to try and help us understand kind of the behavioral adaptations that occur in that first year or two. When we think about our brain from the lifespan perspective, my goal is to understand how the brain is aging across this sort of reproductive lifespan. And to do that and to fit those models and to really know how to model them, we have to actually go into these time points and understand and map those sorts of things. And then we can then also go in and answer questions like, what does that mean for aging, accelerated aging, protected aging, not only the year after they have a child, but the following years and well into adulthood, where we are now a little bit concerned more with neurodegenerative diseases, which also show this sort of sex-specific skew. So I think it's all sort of one big story, and right now we're in one single chapter trying to model it too. And I will say, out of all the research that we've done thus far on the maternal brain, we're still at first-time moms. We haven't studied how that brain then undergoes more change in the second or third or fourth or fifth pregnancy. So we're in a way, it's kind of in its infancy, pregnancy specific changes in the human brain. Other people have started to look at those middle decades of life and look at motherhood and behavior and cognition and how that's protective. But in my area, we still have so much more to do.
I think this has been such a fascinating conversation, as well as about just like change over the lifespan, like you've just explained there. Like, it's really opened my eyes to, how that can happen throughout our lives, instead of, especially like as a kind of youth development researcher, I'm very much like in this little box of like all the important changes happening, you know, early on in life or before you're 30, and like that's what we need to study and understand. But I think it's just such an important message to think about how we are changing throughout our lives, and like how that's okay and that can be difficult, and there's so much to learn, especially about like pregnancy and women's health as well. So thank you so much for like explaining it so eloquently, and also just such a fascinating area of research. If listeners do want to find out more about this topic, what would you suggest that they go and look up?
Yeah, so one thing I will plug, because I think it's a very nice scientific resource, is all of this work is sponsored by the Anna S. Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative, which my PhD advisor is the director of. We have a huge amount of resources and endowment to study now unapologetically women's health and women's brain health. And they have a monthly series that's up on YouTube. You can just search Anna S. Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative, and they talk about a bunch of these topics. They have experts come in to talk about puberty and sex differences that emerge during puberty, pregnancy, menopause, and aging, and then some new innovations for the future, such as leveraging artificial intelligence to better understand women's mental health. And I think that is going to be a fun sort of breadth of women's brain health that you can log on to live or watch the videos later, and it will provide you and show you like the literature you should explore.
Nice. Thank you so much. Chloe, is there anything you want to add or ask before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I really liked the way that you phrased it as this reproductive timeline, because as you were saying, Catherine, like I also study adolescent brain development, and I look at individual differences that occur in brain structure over that time frame, but you get very much into this tunnel vision sort of mindset where you're looking at a certain starting point and a certain end point, and you want to see what's happening for each individual in that time frame. But this really, I don't know, reading this study has just allowed me to kind of take a step back and to look at not only the capability of the brain to keep undergoing these different changes, but also the fact that it's a whole timeline, and that development really is non-linear across this timeline for brain and then for other aspects of development as well. So yeah, it's been super interesting.
So yeah, just to finish and say thank you so much for being here today and just explaining the study so clearly. This is our first, I think, neuroscience topic for this podcast, so it's very exciting.
Yay, I'm glad that women's health space kind of got in that first slot. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope people get from this that, you know, always challenge dogmas, always identify the gaps, and ask some really important questions that may have been overlooked, because they're really meaningful for just us understanding the brain. And this topic is really, really important and understudied, but we're in a new wave of really focusing on this. So it's an exciting time.
Thank you for listening today, and thank you to Laura for coming onto the podcast, and to Chloe for producing and hosting with me. To receive a monthly newsletter from us with the latest episode and updates on events, make sure you subscribe at scienceorfiction.co.uk and your favourite podcast platforms. You can find the links to the research that we discussed today, and also links to support on our website. Follow us for updates on Instagram and TikTok at Science or Fiction Pod, or search the Science or Fiction Podcast on LinkedIn. And if you want to get in touch or have a suggestion for a future topic, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. Thank you to the Young Person Advisory Groups for their input on this series, to Kit Studio for the branding, and Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.